Hello, my name is Matthew Ong, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in the Center for Excellence for Ancient Near Eastern Empires. And I'm making this video as a kind of commentary to the video that Doron has produced on his channel Piece of Hebrew for the video Bring Them Home. I hope that Doron looks at this, but if he doesn't, I hope that viewers who look at the video on the channel will also look at it, because I think that they will benefit from listening from what I have to say if they find themselves agreeing uncritically with Doron's statements. Not to say that what he says is completely wrong, but there are important things which need to be added to that, or important statements which need to be corrected. Overall, it is quite fascinating to see how Doron makes these videos, because I guess they are, assuming that he's not presenting an alternative identity or so drastically, I guess, simplifying what he wants to say, it really is a fascinating insight into the kind of bubble which many Israelis live in as to their level of misinformation, their extreme ignorance, their moral hypocrisy ultimately, and how they seem to really not understand what is going on, coming sometimes from the media sources. And to some degree, this holds for some people in the West as well, but not as much. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have to say first that returning hostages from Gaza is a desirable thing. People with decent humanity want that to happen. And I want that to happen, and Doron wants that to happen. But what needs to be added to that is moral consistency and an actual recognition of the facts, which doesn't lead this desire for the hostages to be returned to simply be an echo of sentimental narcissism, which it seems to be, given what Doron says, in comparison to the actual facts. Let's actually first look at what he says. He says that many of these hostages have been subjected to horrible sexual abuse. Well, I think Doron should provide sources for that. And why do I say that? Because there has been such a steady stream since October 7th, particularly in the early months, of claims of either mass rape, of sexual abuse, horrible violence inflicted on hostages or people killed by the Palestinians in Gaza, when in fact this was all baseless. Whether it is the New York Times, by now probably infamous New York Times article, Screams Without Words, this ridiculous documentary by Sheryl Sandberg, all of the claims that came out from Israeli newspapers in the first few months, or I don't know how many months, but let's say at least the first few months, and which were repeated with great gullibleness by the Western media about all sorts of mass rape and bodies being burned by Hamas. Those simply are significant misrepresentations of what happened. If you want to know a more accurate assessment of who was likely killed, for what reasons, you should look at the following sources, which I will provide here. Because the simple fact of the matter is, based upon independent journalism, Hamas had a specific goal. They wanted to grab hostages, not murder them incessantly. There were other groups which came out which are not fully under the control of Hamas, and yes, atrocities did occur. That's horrible. Those people shouldn't do those things. But you have to understand why they did that. The amount of rage they felt after being penned up in a cage with no hope in sight, and being told, based on their limited awareness within this concentration camp, that the Israeli state was doing this in the name of Judaism. There's a lot more things that could be said about that, but I guess to return to my main point, what are the sources that Doron is bringing about this? I'm not denying that there could have been, and there could still be, instances of sexual violence. Yeah, of course, you have to be more specific of what that means, right? Just because someone says it without backing it up, particularly in this case, when there have already been instances of various individuals, including people, hostages themselves, who seem to want to represent their situation to the Israeli media when their stories don't add up. Or alternatively, where there are hostages who come forth and say, well, we were treated decently, right? And then the Israeli media sometimes does not believe that. We have to be able to trace the facts, where statements come from, and be aware, of course, of how much of a pressure, a temptation there is by various people to want to misrepresent the situation. Now, at the same time, of course, we have to recognize the documented, very clear cases of sexual abuse, murder, torture to death by Palestinians, even, so, I mean, upon, right? This is practiced by Palestinians by Israeli soldiers, prison guards, settlers to some degree, practiced by them, where this is really documented. And where is the concern for those people? They're often not, as they say in the news, suspected militants or terrorists. They're just people on the ground. They're people that the police or the military wants to round up. And again, they have no right to do any of that. Just as, in the broader sense, Hamas has no technically legal right to kidnap those Israeli hostages. Where is Doron's concern for those people? For the anal rape? Where is his concern for the fact that the government and seemingly a substantial portion of the Israeli population has no problem with this type of behavior? They condemn other people for, let's say, the mere thought that this might happen to some of their citizens. But when they do it to other people, it suddenly is okay. And of course, the justifying narrative is, well, they're evil terrorists or such. And it once again shows extreme ignorance, as well as really a kind of inconsistent morality in general about how one should treat people. Just like to add briefly here, the fact that Doron characterizes Gaza as a living hell and that these prisoners are languishing there at under the power of Hamas, whereas the Israeli military is trying all it can do to rescue them. Well, really, for anyone with half a brain who pays attention to independent media, it's quite clear the Israeli Defense Force is really so used to just blowing away Palestinians right and left that they really don't care about rescuing hostages. They are used to basically shooting first and thinking later. That I believe just as many, if not more, hostages have been killed by the IDF in their bombing, their devastation, their murder of the people in Gaza than have actually been rescued. And when those people have been rescued, they have murdered significant numbers of Palestinians to do it. So this idea that the IDF is interested in, let's say, honoring the wishes, the legitimate wishes of the civilian population in extracting the hostages in a morally defensible way is just ridiculous. And if we tie this back to what I've said in previous videos about why Gaza is the way it is, it's not because of Hamas. It's because of Israel. The cruel, illegal, ineffective, ultimately, from a political standpoint, blockade, the starvation of people, punishing them because they basically had the backbone to defy the wish of people to drive them out of the region. That they stayed there. They didn't roll over. They didn't capitulate, at least the leadership didn't capitulate the way that the Palestinian Authority did and essentially all these illegal colonists to come in. The previous videos I've made and many others on the internet make it very clear that Israeli state, regardless of what various individuals, whether informed or naive and ignorant in the state may think about it, the government simply has never been serious about actually honoring in a fair, morally defensible way a kind of peace agreement or doing the right thing if only the people there would lay down their arms. It simply has never been true, especially now. I think it also just should be brought up to make it clear. According to actual objective, let's say, defensible analyses of what happened on October 7th, it seems that the majority of people killed on October 7th amongst the Israeli population can be said to be of two types. There are the soldiers who were killed, mainly by Hamas, the Al-Qassam brigades, the other groups, right, Palestinian Jihad, and then there were the civilians. And those civilians, most of them were killed by IDF-friendly fire. And there were two reasons why. One could say, more defensively, is just it was in the confusion, it was in the chaos, various soldiers on the ground didn't know what to do, but we also have clear evidence of things like the Hannibal Doctrine, where the Israeli government or the Israeli soldiers acting under those orders decided to kill those people rather than let them be taken back as valuable hostages for which they would have to release various Palestinian hostages of their own or make other concessions. That's just clear. Once again, if you actually decide to investigate the facts, you will see that what Hamas decided to do, and those other agents that were under their control, which is not to say that all were under control, they were trying to grab hostages, valuable ones, not random old people, but soldiers in particular. They got a lot more simply because of the chaos that happened, and they tried to give them back. But the Israeli government did not want to listen. They wanted to bomb and exercise their feeling of rage that they had basically been shown up by this oppressed people they thought were beneath them. Now, Doron is correct, roughly, in laying out the political dynamic, or roughly why Netanyahu has not agreed to a ceasefire. That is, he is just trying to save his own skin. I think the situation is far more crass than he puts it. Netanyahu is afraid to be put in jail once he's out of power. He needs this coalition with the even more extreme Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to maintain power and avoid prosecution, as well as basically he is trying to extract some sense of victory from this utter debacle that Israel has got itself in. And that is running against the proper outrage of many Israeli citizens that their desire to see their loved ones is not being respected. That is all very true. Netanyahu is scum, ultimately, right, in terms of his actions. The even more right-wing coalition also doesn't give a damn about getting those hostages back, because what they want to do is use this as an opportunity to finish the ethnic cleansing that they began in 1948. So sacrificing those people's lives is worth it in their view, even if it takes, of course, if you add in thousands and thousands of other Palestinians that most Israelis do not seem to care about. So that part of the dynamic is clear. What should be added, of course, are two things. One is there really is no alternative leadership to Netanyahu, right? I mean, sometimes I forget the names, but Yoav Gallant, right? Like that so-called centrist Lapid, right? They all basically agree with what is going on. The question is simply whether they put a polite face on it, they do it more slowly, they do it in a way that doesn't so obviously outrage the senses of anyone in the world who pays attention to the news. There really is no clear alternative, and that is the crisis in Israeli leadership. It has backed itself into a corner of fascism, where anybody who, there are, of course, people in Israel who know what the problems are and do wish to have what would be a reasonable resolution, I guess, to put it very generically, to what is going on. Unfortunately, there are two things wrong. Those people are not listened to. They are condemned. They are called traitors or terrorist supporters or whatever. And secondly, even if, I guess if there were enough of those people, things could change. But simply, there is really no way out for Israel. Doron seems to think that if we just follow the right solution, if we can just get the hostages back, we can hope to get back to normal. No, first of all, it's a very narcissistic and selfish way of thinking about things. What about all of the Palestinians who have been murdered? About the genocide which has happened, the complete obliteration of Gaza into a wasteland, and the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank, hundreds of whom have been killed by illegal settlers with the full aid of this KKK-like posse that has been taken over the police and parts of the military. Where's Doron's concern for that? Does he think that that's going to go away, or is it just won't matter? Those things are there to stay until, well, I'll get to what might change that. But basically, there is no going back for Israel. There is no going back for those, call them bourgeois, or more secularly, or westernized Israelis of a liberal bent. There is no going back to the old Israel. That, in some ways, never really existed on a moral level. It was a facade for many decades as to what Israel really represented vis-a-vis this other set of people that lay under its power and which were basically hid behind walls and myths and misrepresentations of the news. Anybody who knows history, who actually looks at independent reporting, who's been over there and talked to people, knows that. But of course, that truth could not be contained behind walls even once October 7th. And now, of course, by the decisions of the Israeli government and basically the support of much of the Israeli population for the actions of the military in Gaza and the West Bank, it has now buried itself deep into a hole. There is no going back to those days when you can go driving around most of Israel uh, with the tech industry being productive, with basically going to the beach and not worrying about violence anywhere, and also not needing to suffer the extreme rightful stigmatization abroad for standing for what the Israeli state does. Um, if I may simply summarize it very quickly, the economy of Israel is going to continue to get worse. The growth of the reactionary fascists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich will grow larger as they and their religious supporters essentially capitalize on this kind of built-in, let's say, attitude of the way things are, right? How people tend to react towards these ideas. They will gain a greater control of the state. There is no more room for a pretense of secular liberal values in this state, given what it does. Much like in America, the facade has been taken off, and those people who want to live as a, like Westerners basically, they are now leaving, and they won't come back. So the idea that the problem is with the Palestinians or just with Netanyahu is a facade. This is really the crisis point which Zionism has itself led to, and it's not really that unique in the broader historical perspective. So, yes, getting the hostages back is a thing to be, we should, we all, I hope everyone desires that, but it's a moral narcissism to think that the problem is just that these evil people are holding the hostages for their generic hatred, which is not true, right? They understand very well who their oppressors are. It's the Israeli state, which masquerades under the banner of Judaism. That's not the most significant problem. It's not that it's not a problem. That's not the most significant problem. The problem is the attitude of most Israelis. And on the one hand, while it's good to see so many Israelis now seeing how little their government actually behaves in a rational, empathetic manner, they are still quite in delusion about where the problems lay, about what needs to be done to change, to essentially proceed into the future. Just as with the protests before October 7th about the judiciary takeover, most of these Israelis, not all, but most, are operating on a very hypocritical and ignorant level where they demand their own freedoms while simultaneously depriving those of their neighbors, and they saw no problem with that. But now the problems are surfacing, and just as this protest seems to have fizzled out a little bit with the strike, and just as it's creating pressure but not fundamentally altering anything, it's unlikely that these hostages will be returned under any deal because the government simply cannot accept the defeat that has happened. It would have to recognize much of the truth that is already plain to many, and it would also require basically a great change in the population. And maybe there is room for change, but seeing these protesters, while good, comparatively speaking, is far from enough.